Okay, welcome back to another episode of 2S, the Horror Quarters podcast. This is another Ghosts of LA edition, and we're going to be covering the Unionfield murder, which culminated and began in Los Angeles, in Hollywood, near the Florentine Gardens. Carlos Avenue and Gower, particularly, was where the incident occurred, and it is now named after Ian Campbell, the officer who lost his life in Bakersfield. But it all started on March 9th, 1963, approximately 10 p.m. So officers Ian Campbell and Karl Hettinger were in their unmarked Plymouth 6Z4 plainclothes unit vehicle, and they were patrolling in the area of Carlos Avenue and Gower, particularly in an alley. At this point, they were coming down an alley onto Carlos Avenue. Now, looking at Carlos Avenue now from Google Earth, or even if you go to Carlos Avenue, you can see there is alleyways on each side of the street. One on the north side of Carlos, one on the south side of Carlos. The book didn't specify which alley the officers were heading down as they approached Carlos. I'm going to guess they were heading southbound towards Carlos from that alley. And that is what the movie shows, if I saw that right. So as they approached Carlos from that alley, right around the same time, there were two criminals in a 1946 maroon Ford coupe. A guy by the name of Gregory Powell was driving, and the other guy was named Jimmy Lee Smith in the passenger seat. Now, as the Ford coupe headed westbound on Carlos, it approached a street called Vista Del Mar, and for whatever reason, the driver, Powell, thought that the street dead-ended. So he makes a U-turn on Carlos to head back eastbound towards Gower. And that's where the two officers spotted him. And they looked out of place. The plates were out-of-state plates, and the two men inside of the vehicle were wearing black coats with black snap hats. Just looked out of place, especially that time of night, cruising the way they were. So Campbell got behind the coupe and looking for a reason to pull them over. They noticed that the light was out on the license plate area. They pulled him over as they made a right onto Gower. And you can see the southwest corner of Gower heading southbound is where they pulled him over at. Officer Campbell gets out of the vehicle on the driver's side. Officer Hettinger on the passenger side. Jimmy Lee Smith on the passenger side of the coupe gets out and puts his hands up without being told to do so. Now, both officers only had their flashlights in their hands. No weapons were drawn at this point. So as Hettinger approaches Jimmy Smith is like, hey, what's the problem? And then on the other side, in the street side of the cars, Officer Campbell approaches Gregory Powell and asked him to see his license. So Powell, noticing that Campbell only had a flashlight on him, turns to his right and backs out of the car. And in doing so, he grabs his weapon, turns it, and has the gun pointed at Ian Campbell. He gets behind Officer Campbell and now has the gun in his back. Now they come around the vehicle onto the sidewalk area, and this is where Officer Hettinger notices that something's not right here. Officer Campbell is in front of the suspect, not behind him, and it was a surreal moment. Now, as Officer Campbell confirms to Officer Hettinger that there is a gun in his back, Powell yells to Smith to get Hettinger's weapon. And it was at this point that Officer Campbell told Officer Hettinger to give up your gun. So now Powell and Smith had all four guns in their possession, and they were directed to get into the vehicle. Officer Hettinger was forced to go in the back on the floor behind the driver's seat and keep his hands as high as he can, or enough where they can be seen at all times. He was crouched and cramped, very uncomfortable in the back seat. In the front seat, Powell had Officer Campbell get behind the wheel. Powell then sat in the middle with a gun pointed in Campbell's stomach. Next to Powell sat Jimmy Lee Smith. Jimmy Lee Smith's task was to watch Officer Hettinger in the back for the whole ride up. So before they took off, Powell told Jimmy Smith to get out, go move the police car up a little closer to the curb so it doesn't look as conspicuous. Jimmy Smith goes to the car but can't figure out how to move it and comes back to the coupe and gets in and tells Powell, hey, he couldn't figure it out. Now, both officers had Model 14s, 6-inch barrel Smith & Wessons. Once Smith got back into the vehicle, Powell asked Officer Campbell, does he know how to get to Bakersfield? Officer Campbell said yes. So Officer Campbell made a U-turn on Gower, headed north, made a left onto the 101 North, which probably would have been Franklin. Now here we're facing westbound on Carlos Avenue. And in the distance here is Vista Del Mar. And even now it looks like a dead end. I mean, they have a crossbar across the street now. Really, the street continues on. But just the way the street looks, it appears to be a dead end, but it is not. This apartment building back then was not here. But had they made a left here, it would have taken them to Hollywood Boulevard. So this is what it would have been like if Powell would have made a right on Vista Del Mar instead of U-turning. I don't know exactly where that leads. Because Powell thought it was a dead end, he U-turned and headed back eastbound towards Gower, and this would have been his view. Now, based on what I can see, the two alleys are pretty much right across from each other. Here's an alley here to the left, and then here's another alley to the right. In the book, it's just mentioned as an alley. The officers come out of an alley onto Carlos Avenue, just as Powell and Smith are crossing. So, based on my estimations, it would have been probably in this general area. They approach the light. Officer Campbell and Hettinger light him up, pull him over, and they make a right onto Gower and pull over onto Gower into this area here. Here we are at the intersection of Carlos Avenue and Gower Street. And this is where the abduction started. You could see here would have been where Officer Campbell and Officer Hettinger's car was parked. And right about here would have been where Powell and Jimmy Lee Smith's vehicle was parked. And we're looking westbound at this point at the southwest corner of Gower and Carlos. So I'm getting a little closer here. We just went not too long ago to the area. I wanted to get a feel for the area and get my eyes on the actual area where it happened. I definitely like to visit these locations. It gives me a better feel of what happened, at least on my take of what happened. So right about in this area here is where it all started. Jimmy Smith would have been probably right about here when he had his hands up and had the interaction with Officer Hettinger. On the other side of the vehicle, Officer Campbell and Powell had their interaction, where of course Powell got the drop on Officer Campbell and had him at gunpoint. So Ian Campbell would have made a U-turn here and headed north on Gower and passed up the First Presbyterian Church of Hollywood here and approached the nearest on-ramp, which I believe would have been Franklin. In the movie, the traffic stop was here. It was on Carlos Avenue. I don't know why that would be. If I had to guess, it would be probably because it was safer, maybe permit issues. But whatever case, the actual traffic stop scene was here, right about this area here, just before the alley. Now, at the time in 1963, the 101 North didn't get you to the Grapevine. They had to hit the 101 North, exit Sepulveda, and take that for a ways to get to the Grapevine area. They took the Grapevine up over into Bakersfield. Now, Bakersfield was an area that Jimmy Smith was familiar with, and Smith and Powell were in that area earlier that day, which we'll get into later in this episode. There wasn't much talk inside of the vehicle on the way up. Greg Powell asked the officers how much money they had. Officer Campbell said he had $10, I believe, and then Officer Hettinger had $8 or $9. And Ian mentioned to Powell that, hey, that's enough money to get those two guys to Frisco if they were to just let the officers go. But Powell wasn't falling for that, and they continued their drive on. Officer Campbell was asked why he pulled them over, and he said because of the light around the license plate. Once they got to an area called the Maricopa Turnoff, this is where they exited and headed west. They headed west for just a little bit, and on the left-hand side, head southbound, was a dirt road. They passed the dirt road and then U-turned back to it, and then made a right, headed south into these open fields, these open onion fields at the time. Now, in the distance, though it was pretty dark out there and open and almost deserted, even though there was a lot of crops and stuff, but at that time of night, it was pretty lonely up there. But there was a farmhouse in the distance. Gregory Powell mentioned to the officers that once he drops them off, they can make their way to that farmhouse and call for help. So there was a little bit of hope there in the car at this point for the two officers. Now, heading southbound on this dirt road, they crossed a couple of roads. Now, there were some parts where the dirt there was a little choppy, a little soft, but they approached an open ditch. And what that open ditch was the gas company had dug that ditch to lay a gas pipe in, but they hadn't filled it back in yet. So the coupe couldn't continue on. So Powell ordered Officer Campbell to stop, make a U-turn, and just face north, face the way that they came down. And at one point, Powell even threatened Ian and told him, "You get this car stuck, you're both dead." Here's a shot of us looking east on Maricopa Highway. Out there in the distance, you would make a right. That would be the dirt road that Ian Campbell went down and headed southbound towards where they eventually stopped and U-turned. We're just over the area where the car stopped at. So Officer Campbell would have been driving the car southbound towards us and stopping just about where we flew over. Even today, there's a gas marker off to the right, somewhere where I'm standing there. I'll show another shot of it so you can see. And this is the area where the trench would have been, and the reason why Officer Campbell had to make the U-turn and stop the vehicle. That's me walking northbound on the road in the general area of where they stopped. I mean, that was 59 years ago. I'm sure a lot of this changed, and based on what I've seen in my calculations and research, the area would have been somewhere next to this tower to the right here. Back then, these trees weren't there. Shout out to Forrest Haggerty and his channel. Forrest Haggerty has an excellent channel where he goes over cases and murders and crimes, but he does it via Google Earth. And he really lays it out for you of how things look now versus then, and how the streets are then versus now.